Today, I have the chance to talk to Sathnam Sanghera, for whom I had quite a long introduction written up. However, I've opted to go for his much shorter and far more succinct Twitter bio. It reads as follows: author of Empireland, How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain, memoir, The Boy With the TopKnot, novel, marriage material, writer for The Times, and a presenter for Channel 4. So before we get into the swing of things, I have to always ask, how are you, and especially after the Euro defeat that we're all kind of suffering from?
Actually, I was at the match, which it felt like at the time I was like, oh, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. And actually, it was a total nightmare. I mean, it was total chaos at the stadium, total chaos. The fans were behaving terribly. And actually being near the kind of penalties was nothing to kind of boast about, was it?
No, not for us. No, unfortunately. Oh man, there's so many people that I've spoken to recently who were at the match, and I'm kind of like, I wish I was as well.
No, honestly, you didn't miss anything. Everyone was so drunk because they've been drinking since 12 o'clock, and it was a really grim atmosphere and a grim result. And then we had all that nonsense with the politics and Priti Patel, and so yeah, I feel quite exhausted by the whole thing.
How was it getting out of the stadium, considering the atmosphere and what had happened?
It's very tense for the first 20 minutes. I've got a foolproof plan in terms of getting out of concerts and stadiums. What you do is you get the train in the opposite direction to everyone else. Then you get back on the train and you have a seat. Does that make sense?
Oh, that's so clever.
Yeah, it's the only tip I've got for you today, I'm afraid. But it's a good one.
Yeah, no, that's really clever. As in, you go to the station in the opposite direction and get on the train before it gets to them. No, fair enough. Okay, so moving on from the football, because actually the podcast could just get completely derailed and we'll just end up talking about that for the rest of it. But I guess it kind of relates into Empireland, considering the kind of the language and the politics that you've just mentioned. Now, I just would like to quickly get a brief understanding of kind of yourself and your family background and your history and how that ties into Empireland, because obviously, as you say in your book, we're here because you were there. So people, for argument's sake, who haven't read the book or perhaps don't know too much about yourself, what would you say?
Yeah, who the hell am I? I grew up in a big Sikh family in Wolverhampton, 54 first cousins. I had a TopKnot, although no one in my immediate family, my father and my brother, didn't. My mum got very religious just before she had me. It was very working class. Everyone in my family had a factory job or worked in a foundry. There's only one of my 54 cousins worked in an office. He worked in a building society. And I guess, I worked in a factory myself as a kid. And so we were quite poor, but, very hardworking, classic immigration story. My dad, though, had schizophrenia. My sister had schizophrenia. So my first book, The Boy With the TopKnot, was about that. And also about how I guess I cut my hair and I left Wolverhampton and became slightly distanced from my heritage. But I've been slowly going back towards it with my work, I guess. And is that enough of a summary?
No, yeah, that's absolutely fine. No, that's absolutely fair. Fair enough. 54 first cousins. That's that's amazing.
It's too many, man. I think that's too many.
Yeah, just too many. And so what time period are we talking about then? So when you're saying that, like, when your parents came over to this country, I'm like assuming like 1940s?
No, my parents came in 1969, a year after Enoch Powell had made his famous speech, because he was a Wolverhampton MP, and the Rivers of Blood speech was made in 1968. People forget that speech was inspired by Sikh immigration to Wolverhampton. So I feel like he was talking about my parents, and my family. And so huge numbers of Sikhs were coming to Wolverhampton in that time. And I grew up, only speaking Punjabi. I couldn't speak English when I had my first day at school, and the only white people I ever saw were the school teachers. And it was a very, very Punjabi upbringing. Everyone was Punjabi, the chemist, the butcher, the landlord of the pub, which didn't make sense to me in my child's head because Sikhs didn't drink in my head. And yet so many of my uncles were drunk all the time.
Yeah. No, my father and his brothers grew up similarly, they came to this country a few years after, actually, in 72, because of what was going on in Kenya. And they settled down up north. And most of the stories that they recount to me are just horrific racism or being kind of attacked just because of the fact that they're not white. Now, what was it like for you growing up, considering there were so many of you guys? So like, for argument's sake, when my dad talked about Stockton-upon-Tees, the place that they lived, he was like, there was literally just 2 houses in the local area that were not white. But the impression that you've given is Wolverhampton was pretty much like there was a large community. So to what extent did you have to deal with it?
Actually, you know what? Because I was surrounded by Asians, there wasn't much racism. I was not conscious of it at the time. It's only looking back, I now realize our lives were, constrained by racism. But like memories, like I remember the National Front logo being spray painted on a house near us. And I just liked the logo and I painted it on a balloon. And my sister saw it and shouted at me, but she never explained why the National Front were bad. I remember one of my first memories is also of the whole family hiding in the Sikh temple across the road. And I just liked it. It felt cozy. All my cousins were there, right? But now I know it's because far-right gangs were targeting Wolverhampton and, burning down houses or attacking, immigrant businesses. And so lots of the community were hiding in the temple. So when you look back, you're like, oh, wow. And actually, whenever there was a football match on in town, my mum wouldn't let us out of the house. And that's because Wolves fans were very racist and they were known for wearing KKK hoods to matches, But it's only as an adult I understand that. At the time, I had a very happy childhood. I felt very safe. And everyone was black or Asian, basically.
No, fairs. No, I think the story about the National Front sign is just insane. But it also goes to show, I think, in a nutshell, the environment you're in, but also the way you viewed it at that time. Now, what led you then to actually writing Empireland? So obviously, like, as we've explored, you've come from Wolverhampton, you've experienced quite a relatively comfortable, as you said, upbringing. At what point did you think... at what point did you engage with Empire in the sense of actually, I want to now go and put together this piece of work that's going to focus on what Empireland looks at?
I should say it wasn't comfortable in the sense of money. We were, looking back, really poor. My dad didn't work. I grew up on benefit. But it was comfortable in terms of it was a loving family, which I think is the thing you could be most blessed by, Yeah, I'm not a history student like yourself. I haven't got a history degree, and I always think I'm not interested in history. But looking back at the books I've written, my first book was a memoir, and that was a book about the history of my family. My second book was a novel, which was about the Asian community in Britain. So that was a form of history too, set in the 20th century. And I think Empireland is going further back. And I think as I've got older, I've become more and more interested in the past. But the reason I wrote Empireland is that a couple of years ago, I was sent by Channel 4 to make a documentary about Jallianwala Bagh, the Amritsar massacre of 1919. I didn't know much about it except that scene in Gandhi, the film. And I got there and obviously realized that everyone in India, the man on the street in India, knows about it. They're taught about it at school. Everyone knows about it. And yet, even Sikhs in Britain today, I talked to about it, weren't aware of it. They thought, whenever I talked about Jallianwala Bagh or the Amritsar massacre, they thought I was talking about 1984. The 1984 genocide. And I was like, oh my God, not only do I know almost nothing about British Empire, but actually lots of Sikhs don't either. And that just made me interested in it because I realized there was a massive gap in my knowledge, and also realized there was a massive gap in the knowledge of all the white people I know. We're just not taught about it. So that's when I started to think, you know what, I should write a book about it. Or I just started reading around it just for my own curiosity. And, it was a 3 or 4 year process trying to get your head around this really complicated, painful, agonizing history.
I can well imagine. Just to kind of summarize the book for people who perhaps haven't read it, for me, I just found it absolutely brilliant. It was witty and personal. I thought throughout it was extremely current because obviously you're mentioning the COVID lockdown, and like just the fact that COVID's mentioned in it obviously goes to show how recent it is. And I think it came out quite soon within the first lockdown. I can't remember now actually, but it just seems like it all kind of happened pretty much at the same time. More importantly, for me, I found it really interesting because there were personal experiences that you share that I was like, I can relate to that. And there were frequent references to Sikh history in relation to empire in particular that made it far more personal than I originally thought, because I just bought it because I liked the title of it without any expectation. And when I read it, I was like, actually, this is really, really good. It was a perfect blend of having an in-depth conversation about the various personal experiences that you had, but contextualized within kind of the history of empire. And yeah, I would recommend anyone to go and read it. But in general, what were the reactions that you faced like after it was first published?
It's been wild, man. Actually, it wasn't meant to come out until now, except in the summer of 2021. But it came out early because, you know, when I began it, it was such an esoteric subject. Like I did a reading and my friends were like, what is this book about? Is it a memoir? Is it a history book? You haven't got a history degree. And they were really confused by it. But then Black Lives Matter happened. And suddenly the stuff I was thinking about for years is like a massive story, you know, so it's one of the biggest stories on the planet, you know, and so the publisher brought the publication forward and it's been wild. I mean, I guess it's my first experience of being a Sunday Times bestseller. It's already being taught by schools. Penguin are giving 15,000 copies to state schools across Britain. History teachers are, you know, endlessly quoting it in lessons. Politicians are reading it. You know, members of the cabinet are reading it. It's insane, you know, and there's a TV series coming out soon. So it's been really positive, but also I've had a load of racist abuse as well. So it's been a mixed bag. And I've been trying to rationalize why I've got so much racist abuse. And I think it's partly because when you're talking about British Empire, you're talking about race. You're talking about white people conquering brown people. And also, until recently, the imperial story has been told entirely by, you know, white men in their 50s, 60s and 70s, you know, normally getting off a train on BBC Two, dressed in a red jacket. And then suddenly you got brown people, you got me, you got David Olusoga telling the imperial story. And this is an inversion of the hierarchy of empire. So some people are really triggered. It gets to the heart of how they see themselves. And they see it as an attack on Britain, and they see it as an attack on themselves, that you're saying, you know what, this story is more complicated. It's not the way you tell it. So people are really triggered and people are very excited. So it's a really intense experience.
Just to relate it back to what we started with in relation to the football, don't you think that the kind of the undertones of empire are obviously still prevalent, considering it was racist abuse as soon as 3 black players had missed the penalty, rather than kind of there was no criticism towards any of the white players? Or for argument's sake, the game within which, I can't remember which game, but Sterling scored and then Harry Kane scored the second goal. And all of the newspapers the following day have Harry Kane plastered all over the back page. Am I kind of connecting the dots that are too far away?
You know what I would say, what's happened in the football this week is almost exactly a parallel to what happened to me with publishing this book. Because basically you've got culture war, and they're connected. You've got Black Lives Matter created massive interest in colonialism. Young people, very animated. Suddenly you want to read loads of books about Gala and me and so on. But there's been a massive backlash, culture war from the right wing of the Conservative Party, who've basically saying, you know, this isn't acceptable. We need to protect British history, defend it. We need to defend British imperial statues. And, you know, we need to attack the National Trust for looking into the colonial history of his houses. So you've got a culture war. You've got young versus old, black versus white. And actually, there's a complete parallel with what's happened in the football with a knee, you know, with Priti Patel and a lot of Tory ministers saying, you know, we should boo. It's fine to boo these players for taking a knee. And then what happened is you've got a load of young people, you've got footballers, you've got, you know, who basically defy them. And I think it's an exact parallel. And I think this is why I am not depressed about the culture war around empire, because the government are trying to shut people like me down, and they're firing people from museums if they're trying to decolonize them. They're, you know, declaring war on the woke, but it ain't going to work because our country's changing. It's becoming more and more diverse. It's becoming more and more progressive, and young people just are not going to put up with it. And I've loved the way the narrative has gone. Boris Johnson's gone from, saying it's okay to boo, to saying I never said it was, this is the thing. You can't fight it. Also, it's a really positive story. You know what I mean? Saying, look, you need to find that we need to accept our history. We need to accept the fact that we are brown because we had a brown empire. That for me is a really positive story. And to declare war on that, people like me, is, I think, a very negative thing. And this is why businesses are all over wokeness. Businesses have backed Black Lives Matter because it's a positive story. And they can try. They can try to, all these white men in government, they can try to scream and complain, but it ain't going to work, man. You can't fight this crap.
No, definitely. Just going back to the amount of, you mentioned that you put 4 years into putting together Empireland, and obviously you'd have to put a hell of a lot of research into pulling off such a masterpiece. Now, I just, obviously, because I've got a history background, I love to get into the nitty gritty of sources and the research and kind of what you did and where you went. Could you just expand a little bit on that in terms of where did your research lead you? Was there anything that made you go, that challenges the narrative completely? Was there anything that was a huge surprise, or I don't know, anything interesting?
Yeah. I guess if you knew how I went about it, I think you'd want to slap me around because it was chaos. Because I'm not a historian, I didn't know what I was doing. So I began by just reading all the main histories of empire: Jan Morris, Niall Ferguson, Jeremy Paxman, all that stuff. And people would be like, why are you reading that? They're racists. Or they'd be like, why are you reading that guy, Pankaj Mishra? He's a communist. And I didn't really understand because, to be honest, in every book I read, I found something interesting. Even in Niall Ferguson, I found loads to be interested by. And I think he's not as bad as, his argument's insane, saying we should love empire because it's not bad as the Belgians. He's not entirely as he is characterized sometimes. But anyway, I just read chaotically. I didn't even keep notes. And then I was like, oh God, I better keep notes because I might write about this. So I started keeping chaotic notes. I just made the whole process probably 2 years longer than it needed to be. But then I basically got an historian to help me really check everything I was writing. I actually, in the end, had the whole thing read by 5 or 6 historians because I was so paranoid that I was going to get something wrong because I had massive imposter syndrome. I didn't really. But the thing that really got me was the Sikh stuff because, I didn't realize, this image of the Sikhs as a military people, which is what I grew up with, was, to a large degree created by the British. I didn't realize that some people argue that the British Empire saved us as a community, that we were almost dying out. It's because the British adopted us that suddenly our population grew, that Hindus began, pretending they were Sikh to join the Indian army. I didn't know any of that. And I knew I was here because of empire, because brown people are here, because some white people invaded India. But I didn't realize the Sikh identity was so tied up with empire. I didn't realize we took their side in mutiny. I didn't realize we fought in both world wars in such massive numbers. So that blew my mind. But also that made me, I think, approach the whole subject with probably less anger than maybe some other brown people would, because as Sikhs, we are tied up with empire, aren't we?
So just going back to my history degree, we had a second year project, which was, you could pick whatever it was, and it had to be in relation to picking something from popular history and challenging it. And so essentially I was like, all right, I'm just going to take Sikh identity and look into historical sources and see if I can challenge it. And essentially a very similar thing occurred, which is the modern Sikh identity has very much, and again, there's obviously a wide scale in terms of the debate and where you sit on it. But the British were certainly instrumental in keeping
Totally. And it was the Gurus who created the military identity to some degree, but the British kind of supercharged it.
I would argue they manipulated a new Sikh identity to obviously improve their own lot, but it equally helped us. So when I say that, it equally was like they obviously needed men to fight, and men still needed to earn bread, to put bread on the table, for argument's sake. So it was certainly in both directions. Personally, I would say that the martial Sikh identity the Gurus created is connected to the notion of being sovereign from everything. And I mean that in quite in a philosophical and literal sense, in terms of you're not like you're not obedient to any nation state. You're only obedient to the Guru. As part of the argument would then say that the British identity that was formulated from that Sikh identity is some way. They have similarities, but there's also huge differences. And equally within the conversation in terms of empire, there were always Sikhs that were against empire. So there were a hell of a lot of Sikhs who obviously signed up to fighting the Indian armies, but we obviously can't forget like the Ghadar party.
Yeah, the Ghadar movement. And and actually the British treated Sikhs like crap. I mean, that was really shocking too. The way they almost hunted us for sport during the Anglo-Sikh wars, and the way they blew certain Sikhs to pieces from the end of cannons. And, when they needed to, they murdered us brutally,
Yeah, but I think one thing that your book does brilliantly, and when I had the podcast with Amandeep Madra, your book kept coming up because a lot of the conversation in terms of Sikh history is, or as you know, entwined with empire and the history of empire. And I think you said it earlier, like because of the fact, I think the more you read into it, the more you're kind of like, hold on a minute, it's not as black and white as it once seemed. So for argument's sake, just in terms of the British Empire, when I can't remember what outbreak it was, but the vaccination drives that they had saved thousands and thousands of people in rural Punjab, which otherwise would just die out. Now, I'm not trying to do any type of, and you make a point of this in your book, there's no kind of like balanced approach to empire. There's no like way of being like, oh, like this weighs so much and outweighs whatever. But I think there's certainly a nuance to it.
Totally. I think it's fine to point out certain good things that happened. It's fine to point out genocides and massacres. My problem is when people say overall empire was evil or overall empire was fantastic. I just don't think you can weigh up 500 years of really complicated history and review it like it's a bloody kettle on Amazon.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It's too complicated.
And I think also, just to add to that, I think a lot of people who make those type of statements actually haven't read the history. Like they haven't gone into the nitty gritty of things, because if you do, you realize actually that those type of statements are just foolish, really. Like they don't hold any water or anything. But no, okay, no, definitely. I love these type of podcasts because as I'm going through them, I'm like, that question itself could be an hour in its own, or like that could lead to a tangent.
Yeah. I mean, I realize that with the book, it's like every fact is like there's a book to be written about every fact. Like when you start digging down.
Yes. Well, I think, was it, the guy's name slipped my mind, but it was the soap maker, I think. Yeah, I think that story itself was just, like, I never knew that. Just coming back then to the questions, I think one thing that we've kind of touched upon just in passing is, like, do you think the main problem we have with history of empires is that empire is usually viewed as kind of one big thing? It's kind of viewed as a monolith rather than kind of actually like being kind of dissected or looked into. And even perhaps more so with the British Empire due to the history of its formation and all of the different forces that goes into it. So I think there were a couple of books that you referenced in the early stages in relation to empire that I had to go and buy and read because they just helped, which was like Empire and Sexuality, and I can't remember the other one now.
I think the biggest problem with empire in this country is that we don't really think about it. We see ourselves as the country that won World War II to the exclusion of all other history. You know, we defeated the evil Nazis, and what that does is it helps us forget that we ran the biggest empire in human history, which for at least a century, if not longer, was willfully white supremacist. So I think that's very problematic. But when we do remember empire, we do so very simplistically. Yeah, we view it as one thing, when empire was so many different things. At one point, it was very into slavery. Then it was very much against slavery. We had abolition, right? At one point, you know, the British in India were happily marrying Indian women. And, you know, the East India Company even paid for the weddings. But then suddenly it's possible for white women to come by boat to India, and suddenly marrying or having an Indian girlfriend is enough to get you fired, you know, get sacked from the East India Company. So empire was different things from bend to bend in the Punjab. it was such a complicated thing when it was happening. And so when people talk, oh, this was what empire was like, they're normally thinking about what empire was like in the late 19th century when Queen Victoria was at her height, and empire was at its biggest. And they also think of empire as being Indian, essentially. They're thinking about the Raj, when it covered a quarter of the planet. It was Australia, New Zealand, Africa, and parts of Africa, Caribbean. And in each one of those places, it was different. So, yeah, the complexity is the hardest thing to get your head around.
No, definitely. You've actually kind of answered the next question as well, because obviously, and I'm sure you're more than well aware of this, like when I was growing up doing GCSEs, A-levels, even my history degree, all you learn about pretty much is World War II, Hitler, how the Allied forces won everything. And recently I was reading a book about bows in Nazi Germany and how the Indian National Army worked with the Nazi regime. And a lot of the information from that book actually made more sense of what was going on during World War II in terms of like how India fitted into things. Because one thing that I always wondered is, considering World War I and World War II is obviously happening during the Empire, like you never hear of it really like whilst we were being taught, unless it was essentially, oh, men from the Empire help. Like it's just kind of like a side note. But one thing that I've kind of made a parallel with, like, so if I would say Hitler's policy of Lebensraum instead in terms of having space for Germans to live in, really isn't much different from the idea of empire, which was we're going to take over a space to either take profit from or whatever the case might be. And like I've put this question to a few other people, is do you think that because of the fact that obviously the genocide against the Jews and Gypsies and all sorts of other people that they deemed the other is obviously like, that's not even questioned. But in terms of their bringing some of these white supremacist ideas, was it just the fact that they brought it within Europe that brought them head to head against empire? In terms of realistically, there wasn't much difference in their outlook. Like Hitler even admitted he wanted to ally with Britain, and he was actually shocked. He never thought Britain would go to war against Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I mean, as a rule, I always try to avoid comparing British Empire to Nazi Germany because the two things were so different, and it leads to often toxic arguments. But having said that, Hitler did admire the way the British dealt with Indians. He talked about it quite a lot. You know, he admired the way the British had this white supremacist view and the way they had, you know, a few people, this ruling class ruling millions. And you know what? And in the history of World War II and the way we conquered, the way we won that, you're right in that the contribution of imperial forces is routinely forgotten. You know, after actually World War I as well, when there was a peace march, you know, after World War I, brown people weren't invited. I think there was eventually a march including some Sikhs and Indians, but black people, because I think there'd been some riots or something in Britain involving black people were never invited, even though they fought in their tens of thousands, if not millions, right? And not only that, the other thing that always gets ignored is the financial contribution of empire to winning both world wars. It was huge, you know, arguably, you know, people would be speaking German in this country if it wasn't for empire. And, you know, I've sat through dozens of Remembrance Day services in my life, and not one of them ever mentioned that our ancestors, brown people, were fighting. You know, we will say we will remember them, but we don't remember all of them, do we? We remember some of them.
No, definitely. I think you're right, though. It is dangerous to perhaps sometimes make analogies between the Empire and Nazi Germany, because they are in a lot of ways worlds apart. But I think you're correct, and there are some, like, we have to be honest to the facts.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I've been reading Exterminate the Brutes, which has now been turned to a film. You know, his argument is, you know what, the Holocaust wasn't, an event that came out of nowhere. There were decades, if not centuries, of white supremacy and genocidal tendencies in the West, you know?
Well, I like during my history degree, we studied a lot. I can't remember what module it was, but we studied a lot about how in Europe there were centuries of anti-Semitism, like throughout, like Russia, even in Britain, there were anti-Jewish pogroms, all sorts. And then, there's almost amnesia in relation to that, because it's only like not only that could happen with Nazi Germany. And you're kind of like, well, no, that doesn't pop out of absolutely nowhere. There is obviously a context.
I mean, I do speak out a lot about anti-Semitism, because if you read the history of Britain, you know, whatever happened to brown people, it happened to the Jewish people first, completely. I mean, even in legislation, and the Aliens Act of the 1920s was about keeping Jewish immigrants out of Britain, and that came way before the kind of anti-brown immigration legislation. You know, the best book on that is Robert Winder's Bloody Foreigners. I mean, he just goes through the history of immigration to Britain, and I mean, the Jewish immigration to this country has been resisted, you know, over centuries, brutally.
Insane. And even that we could lead on into a podcast completely on its own. So just coming back to the questions then in relation to your book, one of the quotes that stuck out to me was, "Every empire rests on force. The British were not habitually cruel."
Yeah, I should say that quote isn't mine. It's Jan Morris. I actually disagree with the quote. I think they probably were quite cruel. But it's one of those things where it becomes such a wide generalization that it's difficult to make it. It relates to, you know, what we were talking about earlier about coming to an overall conclusion. But it wasn't linear, and in the way Indians were treated, the way black people were treated, it changed. But, you know, quite late into empire, like Mau Mau, you know, the British were burning alive insurgents in the 1950s. You know, that wasn't that long ago, you know. And sure, I mean, if you want to think about empire being benign, I guess you could think about Hong Kong in the 80s and 90s. And there is massive empire nostalgia in Hong Kong now, because compared to Chinese rule, it seems nice. But I would say that's rare. I would say most of the colonies are happy to be free.
So my question off the back of that quote is, what do you think fueled the barbarity and the violence of the empire? And did these reasons change over time? Because I remember asking, I think in the podcast with Damandeep Madra, asking again about kind of, we were talking about empire and whether it was inherently evil or good or not. And actually, like, history of empires, kind of comparatively, a lot of them have similarities in terms of, for argument's sake, the Sikh Empire wasn't inherently benign. Like, there were all sorts of kind of murderous plots and things that occurred there. So what is perhaps distinctive or unique about the barbarity and the violence that we see within British Empire?
You made a very good point. I think, you know, people criticize the British for being nostalgic about empire, but you won't meet many Sikhs who will say the Sikh Empire was anything other than lovely, cosmopolitan, and benign. And you know what it wouldn't have been, because it involved, you know, conquering, murder, war. There would have been bad things about it, but I've not read anything critical about it ever. And I myself tend to feel very proud of it. And if I feel that myself, I need to cut some British imperial nostalgic some slack, you know, because I think it's something in human nature that makes us want to believe the best about our past, and that maybe we're being rose tinted. But yeah, I mean, the barbarity and the violence is driven by white supremacy, weird race science. But also, I think the thing about British Empire is it all happened abroad, right? And we're an island. And so I think that's part of the reason we don't understand it, in that we've not had this dark moment or the dark night of the soul like America has had with slavery, or France has had with World War II, where we've had to think about what we did because it was always abroad, you know. And so that also meant we could get away with more. And then one thing you really realize when you read the history is how slow the news was then. I mean, it would take months for news of massacres to get to Britain, even in the late 19th century. You know, the news of the Amritsar massacre took a long time to be digested in Britain. And I think that meant that when people were over there, they could get away with more.
No, definitely. And just to add to that, there's a good book by Heather Street's Martial Races. That is brilliant. And what it does is it highlights again the fact that there are these huge times between the information obviously reaching from India in this case back home, but also how the people sending back these correspondents to begin with, a lot of them were actually the military men, and they were essentially using these news messages essentially as Empire Day marketing, almost like tweeting now is what they were doing then, but they were obviously sending the letter, getting it printed where like back home. And it's a brilliant book because I think, again, we've touched upon briefly about kind of Sikh identity. Now, I'm a bit of a stickler to argue that there is a Sikh identity separate from this British Raj martial race idea that I think a lot of Sikhs have kind of appropriated. I don't think there's necessarily an issue with it, but I just don't. I'm a bit of a stickler for kind of tracing things back to their origin, so to speak. Now, just coming then to another kind of inheritance of empire. And one thing that always kind of sticks out to me is it relates to the violence, which is like, to what extent do you think a lot of these post-colonial nations have inherited kind of colonial forms of policing and law and kind of ideas? So for argument's sake, one thing for me, whenever I hear of, especially in India, or police have lathi charged the crowd or whatever, it just makes me think of kind of British Raj or the scene in Bhagat Singh where they're just kicking the crap out of everyone.
Totally colonial. I've been thinking about it a lot in relation to the farmers' protests, and the way the Indian police behave. But I mean, one of the things I was surprised to discover is that the British police system was developed in Empire first. They tried it, I think, on the Irish. And the secret police, MI5, fingerprinting was first developed in India. They tried it out in India, and then it came to London. So a lot of these police forms of security and policing were tried out in the colonies before Britain. And it's obvious that the Indian police still behave like the colonial police. Obvious, isn't it? And also one other weird legacy is that, if you go to any Imperial colonial hotels now in Singapore, in India, there's always a Sikh person at the door. If you go to the Imperial Hotel in Delhi, if you go to Raffles in Singapore, there's always a Sikh. And that goes back to, the way the Sikhs played a massive role in the policing of empire.
Yeah, well, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think China or Singapore, but a lot of the police that were first sent there, they were Sikh. So like, I've got a family friend whose family's from Malaysia. Her father's like 96 or something. Had the pleasure to meet him one time on holiday, and he was basically like, yeah, the reason we're out here is because I got sent here as a police officer from India.
Yeah.
And I was like,
it goes back to the whole martial race thing, but the Sikhs were considered trustworthy.
Yeah, definitely. Which is kind of funny though, because the Sikhs, obviously through the Anglo-Sikh wars, did their utmost to try and fight them, and a lot of them argued that they were betrayed. So, again, I haven't had the fortune yet to read anything too critical of the time, but I just always find it interesting, considering the predominant kind of portion of the community obviously had no qualms with things and kind of followed on. Just to get the last couple of questions in then, one thing that obviously is mentioned throughout or mentioned in the book, and again, it makes it quite relevant and topical and relevant to now, is the kind of argument revolving around statues. Again, we had a similar conversation with Amandeep Madra on the last podcast in relation to statues, and his kind of response in terms of decolonizing things in that relation was almost to be like, just give us space in a museum and let us almost colonize you, in the sense of let us bring our culture and everything that goes with it into that space. Now, why do you think there's such an emotional attachment to these statues? And for me, what makes this really kind of funny really is that even the Colston statue in Bristol was controversial when it was put up nearly 2 centuries after his death by a businessman who failed to raise the £1,000 required. So no one cared then. Why do so many people seem to care now?
Yeah, actually, I would argue they don't care. I think the news has started this culture war where everyone pretended to care. But let's face it, during your life, how many statues have you noticed? There's street furniture. I mean, I got to the end of my book and suddenly statues are a massive news story. And I thought, should I write about statues? And I started and I wrote the draft chapter. I was like, you know what? Compared to like the other legacies of empire, racism, multiculturalism, our wealth, statues are so minor. And I just came to the conclusion that I don't care. I don't care if they come down or they stay up. They don't matter. My personal preference is that we have one day every year where we pelt the statues we hate with tomatoes. They have a similar thing in Spain. Just find the statues you hate, take a load of tomatoes, pelt them. You don't get accused of deleting history. People learn something. It's therapeutic. And we can move on. There's much bigger things to talk about, like how we're a racist society, because, we're built on the history and the monument of British Empire, which was willfully white supremacist for well over a century. I think that's more important. And I think everyone gets obsessed about statues. But you're right, they were, even at the time, and the statue of Clive is better, the one in Whitehall that Rishi Sunak has to look at every day. Clive was wildly unpopular in his lifetime. He killed himself. Samuel Johnson was like, he killed himself because of the crimes he committed. And he was buried in an unmarked grave. And suddenly about a century later, his statue was put up. And the Viceroy of India at the time said, do not do this. It is needlessly provocative. And now you've got all these people defending it and saying it's a great thing. But it's the culture wars. People are being driven to extreme positions, which I think don't represent even their true views. It's just become something that people want to get angry about because they feel they need to.
They're forced to take a side because they think they need to. Yeah, no, definitely. Okay, so I love near the end of your book, you say that imperial history is not separate from regular history. It is regular history. Now, this resonated with me quite a lot because I've seen in a lot of places the whole narrative is just reduced to a simple, easy to digest and comforting 2D tale. So even just with, like, for argument's sake, Sikh Empire, it's often given this really rosy tinge. But in Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji didn't inherit this empire out of thin air. His ancestors had to fight bloody battles where people were murdered and executed and everything else that goes with it. So it's not like the narrative is often portrayed as being inherently benign, but actually it's probably far from the truth. Equally, or a lot of the time, the British Empire is portrayed as sometimes inherently benign, sometimes inherently completely immoral. I think, to be honest, it just depends completely on where you're standing. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So just coming back to that quote, what do you suggest then to ensure that imperial history is seen as kind of regular history rather than as kind of being treated as separate? Like, what do you think? Obviously, your book is doing huge things. The fact that it's going to be in syllabuses and kids are reading it and teachers are reading it and people in the cabinet are reading it, it's obviously having a huge impact, and the fact that we're having this conversation. But what do you suggest would help to make your quote reality?
I think there's an idea that if you want to decolonize the curriculum, you've got to stop teaching the things you normally teach. You need to stop teaching white authors and this certain history. I don't think that's true. I think you can teach a lot of the regular stuff. So, for example, the Tudors. Everyone gets a lot of that. But actually, there were black people in Henry VIII's court, man. I mean, there's a great book by Miranda Kaufman on the Black Tudors. There's a way to include imperial history, even into that history. You can teach World War I and World War II, and you can talk about empire and the imperial contribution. It's like we teach slavery, but we don't teach slavery. We tend to say, slavery happened in America. We don't teach people that actually it was a major part of the imperial economy. That it was the triangle. People don't understand it was us involved in a lot of it. So I think you can teach a lot of the regular stuff. I mean, I was taught Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, the most boring book in the history of the planet. Couldn't relate to it. It was a set text for A level. I've only discovered recently there's a whole critical debate going on about the subplot of related to slavery in that book. Like, all the owners of the houses in the book have got their wealth from slavery. And there's a conversation about whether Jane Austen was pro-abolition or not. Our teachers didn't mention any of that. It would have made the book interesting. So I think you can take regular stuff, and I bet you can find an imperial angle. It's like the National Trust of suddenly finding a load of their houses have colonial histories, and yet the National Trust is seen as the most English thing on the planet. It's not, because, as I said, imperial history is not separate from regular British history.
Literally the last two questions. This one, I was going to ask you earlier, but I just didn't think it kind of fitted in with the flow of things. But to what extent would you agree that empire was only concerned with profit, and when it became unfashionable, like, so for argument's sake, when there's an argument to say that when slavery became financially essentially implausible in certain respects, that's then why certain people were supporting it to be abolished. And also obviously the fact that a lot of the all of the slave owners were compensated for their loss, so to speak, which is ridiculous. But anyway, kind of goes to show that profit is, or arguably goes to show that profit is kind of central to that. Like, to what extent would you agree with that?
Well, the empire is a bit like Brexit. It happened for many different reasons. There's not one overall thing. And there's a chapter about how much of our wealth comes from empire in the book. And honestly, it took me so long. It was about 7 months' work. The first draft was 30,000 words because economic history is very complicated. People tend to say very general things like a lot of our wealth comes from empire. A lot of our wealth of London comes from slavery. And I think if you analyze those statements, you can't really justify them. The more general you are, the bigger the number, the harder it is to justify. But you can point to loads of things in Britain that show that we got a lot of wealth from empire. So the size of Liverpool, that went from being a tiny town to being a massive city because of imperial trade. Bristol, the same thing. Glasgow became the second city of empire because of tobacco and other trades. All the docks in London, the country houses through which all these nabobs, these men who'd made money from India, bought. Clive of India bought, I think, about 10 stately homes. He stole the equivalent of £750 million, or he earned, a mixture of earned and stole. And you can look at the Koh-i-Noor diamond. You can look at the Pitt family, which produced 2 prime ministers. Their entire family wealth came from a diamond taken from empire. The Gladstone family, massive political family, William Gladstone, he went to politics because his family had loads of money from slavery. So you can look at these individual things, and then there's all the companies that began in empire. So I think if you look at individual things, you can see a lot of our wealth came from empire. But when people start putting numbers on it, I think you're in kind of vague, dangerous area.
No, that's fair. The last question, and it's not necessarily a question, it's more kind of your book. After reading your book, there's a few things that have kind of happened since then and now, which I think personally, I think they're kind of related to the sentiment of your book. So for argument's sake, the botched race report by I think the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, and then the UN turned around and said essentially that they're trying to normalize white supremacy. On top of that, you had the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's report, which found that there was pervasive racism that underpinned decisions to bury soldiers during the First World War. And then kind of more recent is how much of Europe and the West are opposing waiving monopolies of COVID-19 medical vaccines and tools and stuff. Now, would I be reaching too far in saying that much of this is related to the legacy of empire?
I think there's a lot there. I think I'll just pick up on what you said about the race report being botched. It wasn't botched, it was deliberate. It was about arguing that racism isn't really a problem, right? And exactly the same thing is happening with the government strategy on empire and the attempts to encourage teaching of colonialism. They don't want it to be taught. They don't want racism to be recognized, because if you recognize that brown people are here because we had a multicultural empire, that they came here as citizens, that we are racially equal, that racism is a problem, then white people with power need to give up some of their privilege. And they don't want to do that. I think that's what it's about. This whole culture war, and it comes out in various ways. You've mentioned a few of them. It's all about saying, you know what? We want to keep things as they are. We want this social class, this ruling class, who just happen to be the Conservatives, to stay in charge. And you're seeing this across the world. It's not just Britain where this is happening. This happened with Trump, who tried to introduce a patriotic education. It's happening in India with Modi and his nationalism, and it's, we have to see it for what it is, and we have to fight it.
Last question, and I promise you this is the last question. I will let you go after this, I promise. I can't remember who it is, but there's some type of day that they want to introduce to schools and make all the kids sing a song. And I saw your tweet about it, which was essentially Empire Day 2.0. Just quickly, I'd love to get your viewpoint on that.
That song was actually, the whole project is a Sikh guy behind it. Do you know that?
Yeah, I know. And that's the saddest thing. I saw the guy that they wheeled out and I saw him and I went, I could write such a long thread about how just because you've got this dude who thinks it's correct. It's like Priti Patel, really. And then Tyra Mings is calling her out. And then you've got people telling him he's not allowed to point out that she's wrong. And I think similar with this guy.
Yeah, you know what it is? The Tories have got a strategy. You know, they get a couple of Asians or brown people to propagate their particular right-wing thoughts, and they think they've won the argument because they've got it. It's like saying I can't be racist because I've got a friend who's brown. So it's a political version of that. And this song was insane. And for me, and people are like, you can't attack it. There's an Asian guy behind it. I was like, I can attack it. It's like there's a man, you know, the East India Company's been brought back in London as a brand, as a luxury tea brand. It's got retail outlet. And it's an Indian guy behind it. And I wrote to Barrett saying it was disgusting, you know, that a corporation responsible for the death of millions is now brought back as a retail brand. And then people are like, you can't say that. It's an Indian behind it. And I was like, that is no defense. You know, just because it's an Indian behind it doesn't make it any less offensive or racist or stupid. And I think this argument is, this way of kind of trying to sell arguments is going to become pretty transparent soon.
No, definitely. Before we finish, I just want to check, is there anything that you wanted to include or add, or there's anything that we've missed out that you just want to mention?
No, I mean, you know what? In general, I don't talk to Sikh bodies or anything religious. And because I've cut my hair and I realize that some people think that if you haven't got long hair, you're not a proper Sikh. And also I described cutting my hair in my book, and I realized that for many people, that's a sacrilegious act. So I don't go around calling myself a religious Sikh. I say I'm a secular Sikh. I happen to have faith, but I don't talk about it. But the reason I want to talk to you, because I made an exception, because I think I really like the way you social networking, and you're open-minded and you're interesting. And I think you proved to be that during this conversation.
No, thank you. That means a lot, and especially coming from someone who my mom got so excited about the fact that I was talking to. So no, like I really, really do appreciate that. I think just to go back to what you were saying there, I think people who would argue that you're not a Sikh, I would perhaps suggest don't necessarily understand Sikh history. I would say that within the Sikh setup, you have Girsdadi, so people who have kept their hair, and you have Sejdsdadi, so people who have cut their hair. And in certain instances within history, you've got people from complete other faiths playing very prominent dear roles within Sikh history. So to be honest, I use the podcast as an excuse to talk to people I want to talk to anyway. And then I just kind of share it because I think, well, if I've enjoyed it, hopefully someone else will as well. And it's proving pretty good. So I hope. I can only say thank you for giving me that exception, because that means a lot. And also I can only say thank you from the bottom of my heart for the last kind of hour or so and conversation we've had.
Well, no, pleasure talking to you, Amar, and good luck with your work. I appreciate it very much.